people talk today about imposter syndrome. Now, I'm not sure you're probably sitting there at that point thinking, I don't think imposter syndrome is probably coined as a phrase then, but when you reflect back, did you ever have those moments when you kind of felt?
When I got to the point of heading up technology for Macintosh Securities, I definitely felt imposter syndrome because I was only 28 or 29 years of age, and I was suddenly building a technology department from scratch for one of the largest stockbrokers in Australia. But what I would say for anyone that ever finds themselves in that situation, don't attempt to navigate it without seeking additional support. I'm sure there are many people that will get upset with me saying this. The methodization of project management. As soon as that happened, we suddenly had role distinctions and boundaries between what you're allowed to do and what not to do. Fundamentally, there are translation errors that happen all the way down that daisy chain. Right? Be really clear on what is the outcome that you're trying to achieve.
Today we're joined by Tony Christensen, a seasoned senior executive and a truly passionate Agilista with over 30 years of experience across banking, finance, telco, retail and online industries. He began his career back in 1985, spending his first 2 decades as an IT director before shifting his focus towards driving business agility and large-scale technology transformation. Tony's career includes leadership roles at major organizations like nabCapital, Telstra, NBN, RBS and Kmart. And he's currently an advisor at Bain Company, while also working freelance as a business agility consultant at different organizations such as Sooner, Safer, Happier. Join us as we talk through all things Agile and learn from Tony's experience. Tony, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you very much for having me.
This is an unusual episode. It's the first time we've met. Normally I know someone fairly well, or to some extent before they come into the studio, but we've never met. So I'm really looking forward to getting to know more about you today.
Thank you.
From reviewing your background and sort of learning a bit about you from what I could see behind the scenes, it looks like you've had a really fascinating career. It's taken you lots of different places and seen lots of different things. So I think there's going to be a ton here to unpack. The 3 themes that we're going to really focus on today is firstly that career journey, and how you really started out in tech and kind of how you've built that to where you are today. Then looking a bit more around Agile, kind of in terms of what is it? I love the phrase Agilista. I've never seen that before. I'm not sure if you've got that trademark, but I thought that's about it.
I don't know about trademark, but I've certainly registered the URLs of things for it.
Yeah. And then kind of leading into that, what lessons we can learn from your experience around Agile. So let's go back. Let's look at your career. And if someone was to go look at your LinkedIn, your LinkedIn starts in 1992 as CIO at Macintosh Securities. But I'm pretty confident something was before that. And my research showed me, I think, A&L Shipping Commission.
That's right. I grew up in an era where there were 2 parts into an organization. And A&L was one of those organizations that purposefully ran 2 parallel paths. One was to hire people that showed the right level of accessible attributes, so their aptitude for something. And they typically paired them with someone who came through university, and they would then join at the same time and blast through, which was a really interesting thing at the time.
So that's incredibly forward thinking, because this would have been probably mid-80s, late 80s. I'm guessing.
That's right. Goodness. So I've just turned 60. You'll have to do the math for me, but I think I was 19 when I joined A&L. I had already done a year or so of mathematics at RMIT, found that once we started talking about the second derivative of angular velocities, I just glazed over and didn't want to pursue mathematics at all.
That's my next question. That's that
trick. Then I became very interested in computing, simply because it was around the era where some of the very rudimentary home computers are available, Commodore 64 and so on. And so I decided to look at Swinburne Computer Science. And whilst I was waiting for that to start, I saw an ad in the paper for A&L, which essentially was offering a career as a computer software developer, but you started as a mainframe computer operator. And they basically worked your way through working as an operator for 3.5 years, and then they automatically promoted you to being a junior programmer, and then you progressed whatever path you wanted to from there. So yes, A&L was the beginning, but it was also a bit of a baptism of fire. It taught me many of the things that actually led me back to what I do today, which I guess will link to your theme number 2, which is all about Agile. But essentially, back in that period, there were only a couple of different roles available in computers if you were working in the technology. And technology reported into finance at the time. Yeah. And my hypothesis for why this was true is that mainframes were extremely expensive. And so you needed to have your CFO on board in order to, suggest that you might invest in one. And at the time, there were an awful lot of bookkeeping going on manually. So if you think about those conditions, who might be motivated to invest in a large computing system? It would be the CFO, and the first thing they would be doing is wanting to automate their function, and then go beyond that. So yes, I joined at that time, mounting mag tapes on computers like you see in the old James Bond movies with the mag tapes going backwards and forwards, and progressed from there. I was working in the era where the 4th generation languages were first being introduced. Ingress, Oracle, and a few others. And I was asked, did I want to pursue programming in COBOL or 4th generation languages with Ingress, and I chose Ingress quite naturally. But I did make sure that I had enough foundation knowledge in systems, writing systems in COBOL, that I could at least offer support when and if it was needed. But that was really the transition to an organization called Syscorp. Syscorp was a consulting firm. Some extremely smart people worked for that, a chap named John Wise, in particular, Leo Chessel. They recognized what they thought was a skill in my software development capability, and they offered me a role. For a young 19-year-old, well, at that stage I was probably around about 23, and working for a semi-government organization like A&L, the salaries are quite modest. They effectively said, if you do what you love doing here for us, we'll quadruple your salary. And here, wow. And so as a result, it was a no-brainer, and off I went. But it meant that I then started to develop in my career with responsibilities that were far greater than my wisdom or my experience. And that probably has helped shape most of the rest of my career, which is learning by doing.
Just interject there. So did you feel, people talk today about imposter syndrome? I'm not sure you're probably sitting there at that point thinking, I don't think imposter syndrome was probably coined as a phrase then, but when you reflect back, did you ever have those moments when you kind of felt?
When I got to the point of heading up technology for Macintosh Securities, I definitely felt imposter syndrome, because I was only 28 or 29 years of age, and I was suddenly building a technology department from scratch for one of the largest stockbrokers in Australia. So there was a whole wave of self-doubt of I'm not really as able to do this sort of work. But what I would say for anyone that ever finds themselves in that situation, don't attempt to navigate it without seeking additional support. And I reached out to a chap named Jeffrey McComas, because Jeffrey was a seasoned media presenter from the UK. His son was Campbell McComas, who was in Australian media. And the reason why I reached out to Jeffrey was because I had to do a board presentation on where did I see technology for this stockbroker in 10 years from now. And quite frankly, I had no clue. Right? I knew about the current technology. I knew about the systems that we had at the time. I really needed to have someone help me shape and polish what I did decide to say, but to deliver it with confidence to be able to overcome what was a terrifying situation, because I really didn't have self-belief other than what I could do with my own hands. The other help that I reached out for at the time was a chap from SMS Consulting who came in and essentially helped give me the basic skill sets required in order to be able to navigate being a young executive in an organization. And that was, that gave me then the confidence that, and also the deep insight as to what I knew and what I didn't know, to then start to focus in on where my conscious incompetence was. And that then helped shape things beyond that.
There's a couple of things that, as you were talking, that were going through my mind. This would have been early 90s. So there's no LinkedIn.
No.
There's also no Gartner. That's kind of creating the. So I'm just trying to take us back to contextually, because when you say now I've reached out to this person and I had to kind of fill this gap, it's a very different concept to how someone would do that today. How did you go about reaching out and making that connection? Was it just good old pick up the phone and?
Yes, it was. Very much so. It was. We only had newspapers to rely upon, yellow pages. The internet was so very, very new that it certainly wasn't developed enough to be able to do research on. So on that type of research, but also networking. So people like, and this is part of the reason why I'm here today, is people like Leonie James, who I had met not at that time, but further on in my career, and it was reaching out to recruiters and so on, and they might say, well, have you heard of, and then they might pass on a referral. And so I would then hunt these things out. But I think this is actually probably anchoring in on something that is also, I recognize as an attribute, which is continuous learning. I am constantly trying to learn more and self-reflective of what I'm not good at and what I want to be better at and what I want to be known for. So yes, it was very much about networking at the time, as opposed to.
And by the way, I think both of those things are probably still true and relevant today. The continuous learning and networking. I think probably the difference today is that we've got such a huge amount of learning that you can do. There's so much information. There's so many different sources where you can go to. You probably had a much more refined source at that point. And similarly, your network, but equally the network was smaller. It's harder to connect with, but once you did, you probably formed a deeper bond. It's one of my concerns today is I see people with hundreds, thousands of connections on LinkedIn, but they're all very superficial. Don't really know those people, not necessarily developing or spending the time to understand the way that you can augment each other.
Yeah, no, it's very true. You also need to recognize that at that time, which is some 35 years ago now, the industry was much smaller. So Melbourne was not this metropolis. It wasn't.
Yeah.
I think from memory, there were only maybe a half dozen high-rise buildings in the city. So a lot of people knew each other at that time. I mean, that's true today, but once you get outside of sort of a group of maybe 120 people, Dunbar's number, and that you don't actually are able to form insightful relationships with people. And so at that time, there were only a few companies that had, I guess, noteworthy people that you would want to seek out and speak to.
Yeah.
And that actually was, one of the things that then helped me transition to why I started to pursue Agile is because at the time, I had some very significant challenges. I think it was National Australia Bank that I was working for. And I don't know if you recognize the pattern, but the typical pattern was CIOs only lasted maybe 3 to 4 years. And the typical, I guess, agenda when a CIO would come in would be to distribute technology out to the business divisions.
Yeah.
Or centralize it, and it would be this constant flux in and out. And it was largely driven by business dissatisfaction with the technologists and the teams that were working with them, that they wanted control. So you'd see them be decentralized. And if the CIO didn't agree with it, well, then the new CIO would agree with it because they'd be hired to bring that about. And it was during that this cycle or one of these cycles of centralizing, decentralizing, and new CIOs that there was a new CIO, National Australia, back in the capital markets division, which doesn't exist anymore, but it is called nabCapital. And he had given me the challenge of, I'm going to centralize all of the technology teams again. And what the problem that I want you to address is, I want you to create a consistent quality of work that is performed by our technologists. I'd like you to ensure that our business stakeholders are happy with the outcomes, but we need to simplify what we do so that there isn't such variation in the way in which software is built and the way in which risk is managed, etc. And having this as my first, if you like, challenge to really reshape or transform a group en masse. That's where I reached out and sought help and was advised by a really clever man named John Field. He said, have you heard of this thing called Agile? And so this is about 2003. And I said, no, I hadn't. Describe it to me. And put super simply, and this may be leaping into your second theme too early.
Yeah, but I don't want to run with this. This is good.
Okay.
It's good.
The basics that he described in was Agile is about having a small group of cross-functionally skilled people working to create regular releases of customer value. So regular releases of software, regular releases of something that will be valued either because of its usability or its functionality, etc. And that the number of roles that existed had been thinned down such that, and this links back to my A&L days, there were only a few roles in the company back then in technology. Essentially, you had someone that helped you organize your work and manage what's the most important thing for the team to focus on in this particular period. We're not done until we've actually produced something that's working in the hands of someone to give you feedback on. And it also recognized that there's no certainty in software development. No matter what anyone tells you, there is no certainty in software development. What there is a lot of risk mitigation to create the illusion of certainty. But these things sort of resonated with me. And I said, well, how do I find out more? And there was a very small group of CIOs in Melbourne at the time, people like John Dalton, who is now the CIO of REA. He at the time was the CIO of Learndy Planet. There was John Sullivan, who was the CIO of Census from memory. And they would meet sort of once a month or every so often and just share their war stories, their successes, their failures with experimenting with applying Agile. And so I networked with a small group of people very early. I learned enough from them to go, this reminds me of all of the goodness that used to be in place when I was developing software. And if I could then apply that to this group of 300 odd developers, testers, BAs, then I think that I have a chance of creating a simple, less complex way of delivering business value regularly to delight my business customers, but also to create higher levels of happiness within my teams. So that's sort of the segue.
Yeah, interesting. So it's interesting how you learn Agile, which is, again, that network and going and working with people that were going through the similar challenge. Was there an organization or organizations at that time that were training and equipping people and upskilling?
Only one that I knew of. And in Melbourne, there was, I think, only 3 employees. ThoughtWorks. ThoughtWorks is now obviously a really large global organization, but in their early incubation period, um, they were some of the smartest, both EQ and IQ, people that I've ever worked with. And the same is quite true of most of the people that work at ThoughtWorks. And so they had this incredible ability to explain and empathize, but at the same time show you things that were common sense to them in terms of techniques and practices that was kind of mind-blowing to me. So I'll give you a couple of specifics so that you understand why it anchors back to my A&L days. When I was working at A&L, as a first-year programmer, you were given systems that you were responsible for building and maintaining. Now, normally this is done by teams of people and multiple hierarchical roles, product owners or project managers, program managers, etc., platform owners. But back then it was a single individual, and you wrote, you were given some requests, and I'll give a real example. The CFO asked me to produce a new financial report for him. And he would show me what his people were doing manually today. So he'd show me the ledgers and he'd show me the additions and so on they would do. And he'd say, can you automate this? And so I would go away, and within a couple of hours, I would come back with the first mock-up of what that might look like. And I would show it to him and say, is this what you meant when you said? So I was getting rapid feedback back and accessibility to the person who needed the outcome that I was to produce, and the ability to have it fully accepted that what I'm going to show you is not meant to be perfect. It's being shown to you so that I can demonstrate that I understood and be course corrected if I haven't. And then once, through this iteration of development, you then finally had your code in a working state. It would run as batch jobs in the evening. Now you've gone home. But if your batch job failed, you were the one that was called, and you would have to come in and you would fix it and then rerun it, and then you would go back home again. And so owning the quality of the work that you did was just inherent in the job. There was no one else to pass it off to, no ticket to raise, to give to some faceless crew of people. And so it actually drove behaviors in you as a developer and as a technologist to make sure that you didn't get woken up in the middle of the night, right? Yeah. So you try to build in belts and braces into your code, understand and do a lot of testing that would avoid those painful moments. Fast forward to what ThoughtWorks were teaching. They were essentially teaching exactly the same thing. Yeah. That is, where possible, remove all of the people between you and the person that's asking for something. And the more I focused on this later, we were talking earlier before the podcast about you have a degree in organizational psychology, I think you said. I started to understand some of the things that interfered with producing good work as a technologist. And I attribute this to, and I'm sure there are many people that will get upset with me saying this, the methodization of project management. As soon as that happened, we suddenly had role distinctions and boundaries between what you're allowed to do and what not to do. The handoffs that you have between the person that listens to the customer, to the person that writes that down, to the person that then needs to interpret that, then etc. Fundamentally, there are translation errors that happen all the way down that daisy chain, right? I mean, the game Chinese whispers, oh, we aren't say that anymore, are we? Because it's politically incorrect. Yes. My children have been correcting me. You can't. It's a game where you sort of say something into someone's ears, right? And then eventually at the other end, I think the example my father gave me was, they sent someone off to say, we're going to advance, send reinforcements, and by the time they got to headquarters, it was, we're going to advance, send reinforcements. Yeah. So yes, there's this translation error that happens between what you thought you said and how it then came out in words, how it was heard, and then how that person interpreted it, and then they could be poles apart. And so understanding it's not just the psychology, but the physical things that happen can lead to such translation errors between what's wanted and what's actually done.
That's right.
That's only exaggerated and magnified if you have multiple people in the chain. So they said, well, why don't you try to remove as many of those people in the chain as possible and just have people talk directly to the person who's writing the code and the person that needs the work done. So that was one of the many, many aspects that ThoughtWorks started to teach me at that time, which resonated all the way back to my origins.
So it sounds like when you sort of encountered, I think you said John Field, introduced you to this, it sounds like that was kind of crystallizing your ideology.
Yes, it was.
Is how I would describe what you kind of went through there.
Yeah, it was. So I actually been able to reflect on this often, which is that I, at that stage of my career, felt deeply uncomfortable with the trajectory where technology was going. That is, this methodization of project management, if you like, there were also some other things like major incidents that occurred in industry that precipitated things like the Sarbanes-Oxley regulations and guidances, which started to talk about segregation of duties and so on. That I was so uncomfortable with the way in which the world was going that I couldn't put my finger on it. But it wasn't until people like John Field and ThoughtWorks reflected on what better practices were, because they were talking about the Agile Manifesto, about the 4 values and the 12 principles that each of the co-authors of the manifesto had come up with, that hit a deeply resonating bell with me, where I went, and that's what's wrong, and that's where I need to start to wind the clock back.
So I'm bubbling with questions here, by the way. The kind of opposing ideology, for want of a better word, to Agile is waterfall. Is that fair? That's it's thought like speaking.
It is a common enough description that yes, we'll run with that.
Yeah. Okay. So what do you see as the flaws of waterfall then, specifically, that this addresses?
So waterfall, when done well, can be equally as successful as Agile done well. In circumstances where there is high degrees of predictability or familiarity with what it is that you're going to do. As soon as there is, actually, I'll just digress for a second. Are you familiar with Knefin?
No.
Okay, Knefin is the brainchild of, I think it's David Snowden in the UK. And what essentially, and this is a super summary, he does is he talks about the fact that there are 5 elements to Knefin. If you were to look at it as a sort of a 2x2 with a bit number, the bottom right hand is things that are simple, for which there are no knowns.
Right.
Yeah. No known unknowns and no unknowables, right? In those circumstances, if the task is known and simple, there is typically a known response to it, a known solution, a known way of approaching it, in which case it doesn't matter if it's waterfall or Agile or Kanban or any other technique that you might choose. It's fairly straightforward, and there's a high success rate. But not many things actually sit in that quadrant of problems or challenges. The next quadrant is, and I may get this wrong, it's complicated. where there are some known knowns and there are some known unknowns, for the known unknowns, you can't actually therefore predict what's it going to cost and what's the effort going to be accurately. You can roughly size those things, but by and large, that's where elements of expectation management and disappointment management need to creep into the way in which you represent the work, right? That is, when you go to project meetings or your quarterly events, you need to recognize that if there are some known unknowns, then there needs to be variation in expectation of results. Then the next quadrant is complicated. There's complex and complicated. I may have them around the wrong way. Where there are a series of known knowns, a series of known unknowns, and a series of unknowables.
Yeah.
You couldn't possibly predict them. A real world example of that would be when you are heading off as an early explorer on the big ships. There are certain things that you can predict.
Yep.
Like we know we need provisions. We know we need to take enough material to repair sails, etc. But the unknowables are the things like we don't know if we're going to discover land or what we actually might find there. All we can do is try and accommodate the event should it occur, but we don't know what we're actually going to discover. The last quadrant essentially is that everything is unknowable. And so that quadrant is chaos. Okay. In which case, and I won't talk about the one with center because that blows people's brains, but if you want to go and look at it, it's easily Googleable. The reason why this is relevant is that depending on the problem set that you're dealing with, you need to be able to work out which quadrant does this problem sit in. Is it in simple, for which you therefore can provide reasonably predictable outcomes, or is it in one of the other quadrants? And that's where the big difference between waterfall and agile reside. Waterfall tries to presume that everything is knowable.
Yeah.
And when it's not knowable, that we can deal with that by having, if you like, some contingency declared in either the timelines or the costs. Neither of those two things are desired by organizations. They don't want to know that you've padded your budgets with these things. They do want to know that you're managing risk.
Yep.
But they want you to manage risk down to the smallest possible variation of risk.
Well, and I think that was one of the things that was going through my mind there, that the boards don't like risk. They like knowables, when they're signing off checks for millions of dollars to implement something. So I understand why waterfall would probably be quite appealing initially as a concept, yes, as board level. So how do you then take let's say a board on a journey, and you have over the last 20 years, to get comfortable with the concept of agile?
Well, in part by describing what I just described.
Yeah.
And that what we need from them is to accept that when something contains levels of uncertainty, that we will need the leadership of the organization to lean in and frequently understand what have we learnt from what we had planned to do.
Yeah.
How does that inform us as to what we need to do next? And how do we try and ensure that we're heading still towards the outcome that we have said to the board that we would like to deliver, that we have said to market analysts and shareholders, because it affects the share price and so on. So what I need to do is to take them through this learning journey of predictability is actually something that is a falsehood.
Yeah.
Whatever plan you have today, I guarantee you will be wrong tomorrow, right? And just because there are things that you don't know. So I need to take them on a little bit of a journey. What they're most concerned about is how do they manage reputational risk? How do they manage performance risk of the organization overall? And that's where Agile has typically had a very bad name for itself. because people have just interpreted Agile to mean there is no plan. Or we only plan in little bits. As the Agile industry has evolved over the last 24 years, and actually it was developing long before the manifesto was written, that coming up with ways to help provide levels of course correction and still having levels of predictability have had to be introduced into the techniques of Agile and so on. And so I then talked to the executives about what those techniques are in order for them to say, okay, I see the benefit of not relying upon absolute predictability of how we're going to get there by applying these techniques that actually help us course correct as we need to still get to the destination. So I'm going to share with you an analogy, if I can resist it. It's like sailing, as in sailing a yacht. If my destination is 40 kilometers straight ahead of me, but I have winds that are either coming straight towards me or periodically changing direction, they're creating a certain level of upright. I can't travel in a straight line unless I am under my own engine power. Sailors have to sail across the wind and they have to tack. And they know they're being successful in getting towards the end goal, the destination, if they've made some level of forward progress towards it, even if it was in a different direction. And the art and the science is of knowing when you tack and come back across. Are the conditions right? Has the wind changed sufficiently that if I now turn and tack, I'm still heading in a forward direction until I know then that I need to tack again. And so uncertain software delivery is all about knowing the points at which you tack in order to still get to the end destination. So in terms of executive outcomes, they want to know you're going to get there.
Yeah.
Or if not there, that you've actually mutually agreed that it's the island to the right of that. That's the new destination.
So what's the secret to knowing when to tap, so to speak, as you described?
Be really clear on what is the outcome that you're trying to achieve. Ensure that you have clear, measurable things that tell you, are you heading towards that outcome? And or have you arrived at that outcome? So again, I think we talked earlier before the recorded conversation about the difference between KPIs and OKRs.
Yeah.
So the OKRs are the things that the organization wants you to achieve. These are our objectives and our outcomes. The KR is the key result. What's the measurable thing that tells us, are we still tacking, still heading the right direction? But if we're not improving, for instance, the result we expected, then we might have to pivot and tack. So do something differently in order to continue to try and hit the outcome and the objective. That's different to KPIs, which is, what's the health of the boat? Do I still have water and provisions to be able to make it all the way to the destination? Do I still have wind in the sails? Now, these are KPIs. Right. They're about the health of getting there. OKRs are all about the outcomes and the results that will tell you, are you still heading towards and or if you landed there.
So presumably sometimes you have an OKR with a result you're intending to get to. You may have to realize the KPIs are wrong.
The KPIs
or needs to be recalibrated.
Yes. So the way that I would describe that is there are most KPIs are actually sensible things like other, what's the team happiness? What's the customer happiness? What's the do I have enough? What's another good example? Do I have enough left in the budget to continue the journey? There are times where KPIs might fall sufficiently out of tolerances. A good example of that in my sailing analogy would be the wind is dropping too much, we're actually going to stop, right? But you then go, okay, we need to, for a short time, focus in not on our current OKRs, but how to bring that KPI back into a tolerable level. Yeah. Cybersecurity is a good one, actually. Organizations might go, we actually have to stop developing all of these great systems and features temporarily whilst we address this cyber attack or vulnerability. And so that under normal circumstances, it would just be, is there sufficient secure software being released?
Yeah.
But when you're under attacking of a vulnerability, it's gone out of a health tolerance, and you have to make it an objective. We must address cybersecurity now before we then resume our journey.
Yeah, that makes sense. I love a sports metaphor, and I often think about KPIs, and I explain this often. Do you follow soccer? Do you like soccer?
I'm
going to get Aussie with
no. Well, so I understand enough about soccer to, I'm sure, enjoy the analogy.
My kind of analogy is that a player will go on a field, pitch, and they will complete the number of passes, number of tackles, number of shots on goals, whatever it could be. There'll be different complexities to those things. And with the data now, they will analyze that after the game and see, was that player effective? Did they contribute to the performance of the team to get to the result of the OKRs you're describing? What do we need to work on training this week? Maybe the completion of passes over 10 meters was too low for the standard we're playing at. So what do we need to work on this week specifically to get to it? And that's how I try to use or look at KPIs, for example, within our business. It's not telling a person necessarily how many calls or how many meetings or how many resumes to send this week. It's looking at, did they have the ability to do that? And then what conditions needed to be true in order for them to get to that right level of performance. And I think that's what you're kind of centering in on.
Yeah, it is. And I think that the overlay on that is it's important what you measure and what you don't measure, because it may drive unexpected behaviors.
That's right.
Right. So, in your example, for instance, if it was a coach saying you actually didn't have what we consider to be the healthy number of kicks over 10 meters or whatever the KPI is, instead of focusing in on getting a goal and winning the game and being a good team player, the players might go, well, coach says I have to kick more kicks greater than 10 meters, which is not an outcome focus, it's a activity focus or a output focus. So you have to be careful with your KPIs, what you're measuring, to understand what behavior are we driving or expecting to change as a result of this KPI. One of the laments I have all throughout my career, which I try to ensure that any clients I work with these days is conscious of, is you need to be careful when you set up a KPI of some kind. It has to be thoughtful about what's the behavioral change that you expect, but also you should have at least one or more other measures that tell you, have you adversely impacted some other aspect of your system of work or of your organization. Things like when COVID struck, and now that it's we're all past those troubling times, some of the things that companies are reintroducing are things like time in office, with the intent of it being more about we're trying to get people to collaborate together better. Which number one, I'd love to see the hypothesis statement behind that and what's the data that proves that that's actually true or not. But essentially, that starts to drive behavior of people thinking, well, in order for me to get good performance reviews and be seen to be minimally compliant with the organization, I must front up to work 3 to 5 days a week, whatever their requirement is. But what's the adverse behavior that is then? That's right. Needs to be monitored and watched.
So I can give you an example actually of that specific point. I saw some data. There's a guy called Nick Bloom, Dr. Nick Bloom, a guy from Stanford. He's been studying remote working since before remote working was a thing, probably 20 odd years. But his data showed that pre-COVID, this is in the US, the average worker commuted 10 miles to work. Post-COVID is now 26 miles because they're in the office maybe 2 or 3 days of the week. So if you actually take that as a radius, and you went further in maths than I did, but if you work it out, I believe the footprint is about something like 100 times or 1,000 times bigger. So the talent pool is just grown enormously for organizations in order to go find the best people to come in to achieve the goal of the business.
Yeah.
So then you flip it on its head and say, come and be in the office more. your talent pool shrinking that's the kind of thing you're talking about, isn't it? As in, is there a negative consequence to the behavior that you're trying to introduce?
That's one of many.
It's one example, but
it's a rabbit hole that if I go down it, I'll be grumbling about what's post-COVID's meant. But yes, that's a new example.
I was also thinking about when you were describing earlier about the different quadrants, and COVID was chaos.
Yeah.
Right. Now look at the Victorian government and all the other and global governments everywhere, but that was chaos.
Yes.
And it ultimately needed an agile approach because everything was unknowable. Yet what was interesting is I felt that the public and the press were craving waterfall. They wanted to know, when will lockdown be over? When will we have a vaccination? And when will this stop? When will people go? But it's impossible to answer that question.
No, but what I will say by observation is that some of the most amazing responses to that chaos was enabled because instead of restricting people to, you must have deeply thought this out, written it down in a 100-page document before you can then test it and execute it. We would never have developed a vaccine in that time frame. We would never have been able to develop corporate policies that allowed businesses to actually continue to operate and survive during that time. I was very fortunate, actually, as a little segue, to have been asked to help Kmart out during that period.
Yep.
Because Kmart was one of the organizations that was significantly disrupted. Its stores were shut down, and because of the nature of its business, it owns its supply chain as well as the sourcing directly from suppliers without having middlemen in between and systems. So they had their supply chain shut down. They had their goods and products producers shut down or significantly diminished. So their business was bleeding badly, and recognising that they're part of the Wesfarmers group, and Wesfarmers has an expectation that what it invests in each of its brands, it will get a good return on investment. And Kmart had also developed this wonderful multi-year strategic plan. So it had an outcome. I'm going to get this wrong, but I think it was 10-1-6, 10 meaning the number of millions, I can't remember, millions or billions of dollars in turnover per year. The one was the profit, net profit after tax, and the 6 was the number of stock turnovers. Now, this is a very simple true north to be pursuing, but COVID was putting that not just at risk, it was almost guaranteeing that they wouldn't hit it. So they needed to look for help in ways of navigating their way out. They therefore approached, and I was working for and still am as an advisor, Bain Company, and they were looking for Bain to help them navigate out of this crisis that they were in. And being the advisor to them, I talked about the need to be able to manage uncertainty and the lack of predictability, which is what we're in. And so Agile was the best approach to try and address this. So we kicked off what was not only an incredibly successful a program of work called DISCO. I love the name because it's an acronym for the digital optimization of the supply chain. Right? DISCO still, as a program of work, goes on today because of how incredibly successful it was at bringing the executive close to the problem sets, setting up dedicated cross-functional teams that had a very specific problem to solve in this digital optimization of the supply chain. The teams had direct access to the executive decision makers who went through a learning process of, instead of asking, why aren't you on track with what you said you were going to do, instead to say, what have we learned? What value have we created that we thought that we would create? And how can I help? What are the things that are impeding you, that are getting in the way? What are the things that I can do to help support you? And that's why it's still in existence today. It's been the most successful implementation of Agile in that I'm aware of that came out of the COVID era as a direct result of the chaos that was created by COVID.
Yeah, interesting. I think COVID definitely sharpened the minds,
Yes.
and it created a lot of conversation, discussion, deep reflection. No one could have predicted it was going to happen with the velocity it did or the expectation. I still remember vividly, January, February that year. As a team, we're looking at the newspapers in the kitchen and talking about it, and there's a few cases in China and so forth, and what will happen next. No one could have predicted. It was insane. I think what's sad though now is I look back and there's so much of an autopsy on decisions that were made, how things were done. People were having to make decisions on the cuff, on the fly, and this is not with any political steering or intent when I say this, but I don't think anyone would have wanted Daniel Andrews' job.
No, and I think this is one of the rotten things about human nature is that in order to, if you like, bring someone down a peg or two, what they're looking for is flaws.
Right.
And if they're looking, 2020 hindsight is perfect. So if you look back on what Dan Andrews was doing, you could say, well, you should have done this, should have done that. What I found to be universally true, unless there is some sort of psychological disorder, which we can't discount, is that people are making decisions based on the information and knowledge they have at the time, and they're making the best decision based on the information and knowledge they have at the time, which, with more information or hindsight information, you might have made a different decision, but you need to assume that everyone is making the right decision. Leaders are making the right decision, teams are making the right decisions, and there is no point in prosecutor, I can't pronounce it, prosecuting something in hindsight with the purpose of trying to find someone to blame and someone to receive a penalty for the outcome. Instead, what we should be doing is looking at, and there's a whole another topic that we could talk about called safety culture too, which is all about we need to make it safe for inconvenient truth and new information which is detrimental to us to be surfaced, so that we're then able to learn from that on what we will do differently with it now. And I think that's one of the things that came out of COVID for a lot of people and a lot of organizations, but not for those that are politically minded that want to bring Dan Andrews down a peg or two.
Well, that's right. Or I think it became a stick to beat any politician that people didn't particularly like. And obviously I follow British politics and everything that kind of went on around Boris Johnson and the cake and the birthday party and so forth. So I think, I can't imagine the pressure and stress that cabinet group were under at that moment of time. And I had a cake and a party to probably have a bit of a light moment and celebrate someone's birthday in the midst of it. And suddenly the guy's being called for his job. It just seems, again, there's way more to it than that. And I'm sure I'll upset somebody with that comment, but it just seems like a massive, it just, we're human. We're all human. Trying to do a job at the end of the day. Yep. By the way, I always think now, it makes me smile when people use the phrase 2020 hindsight, because obviously it happened in 2020. It just seems like a very poignant phrase now to say to say that. Let's talk about, when does Agile go wrong?
Have you heard of Cargo Cult?
No. Sounds like a sort of 80s progressive rock band or something.
It'd be a great name for it. No, so if you want to Google it, what you'll find is that essentially during the early part of last century, where there was a lot of global wars happening, Second World War and so on, one of the things that the US military used to do would be to establish bases on these remote underdeveloped islands in Micronesia, or I think it's called, and essentially the indigenous people of those islands would see these big, bright, shiny, enormous birds land on places that have been cleared, and out of the back of these birds would come all of this bountiful cargo and amazing things. And in their limited belief and understanding systems, they thought that if they reproduced what they saw, the actions and behaviors and the ceremonies and so on, that would bring the birds with the cargo back. And so if you Google this, you'll see there's images of these native people who have made themselves sort of like bamboo goggles, and they sit in towers, and they have built planes out of whatever material they could find. And they were having these regular ceremonies of trying to reproduce what they saw that the Western part of the world had developed, but with no clear understanding of how does it work, why does it work that way. The reason why I tell you this is because I think the biggest failing and biggest challenge for people adopting Agile is to think that if they just repeat what they've seen someone else do without understanding how it works, why it works when it doesn't work, then all they're doing is they're displaying cargo cult behaviors, which will fail far faster than anything else. So you people need to understand the why, the what, and the how, and also understand that it's not a strict formal recipe for any one of those things. Many large failures of Agile in industry have been a direct result of someone buying and installing Agile in their organization without having a deep understanding of how to operate it, how to make it work, etc. So that would be my simple answer.
What's the first red flag you see that somebody's running Agile but don't know what they're doing?
If the leaders who are asking for it or running it can't actually tell you even just the basics of why is Agile a successful mechanism? When do you apply it? When do you not apply it? I gave you an example with Kneffen model. When is it applicable? When it's not. If they can't articulate that and simply can say, well, we do stand-ups, we do retrospectives, we deliver in sprints, which is the most common application of Agile has been using Scrum, which also has a bit of a crazy misnomer. Or if they're constantly referring to things like the Spotify model without being able to explain to you what were the conditions that made the Spotify model work for Spotify, and what's different about Spotify to their circumstance. Those are the big red flags for me.
Yeah, interesting. I think it's you see this across business in all different walks, right? The Spotify's a good example where you'll see someone say, the culture at Netflix is what we want here. So let's, the other great one I come across a lot is the All Blacks rugby team. You've come across kind of sweeping the sheds. Mm-hmm. Right, so let's get everyone now to tidy their desks and sweep the sheds, because that's what the All Blacks do, and that's what the greatest rugby team on earth. Again, they're not really understanding where that kind of sits within the hierarchy of what they're building or what they're putting together. It's you come across the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's kind of what I feel that I see when I come across this is there's someone with a very small amount of knowledge that suddenly thinks that they're an expert, but they're not prepared to put in the hard yards to go and or ask the right questions or expose themselves to go through that learning curve.
It's I'm glad you mentioned that, because it's actually one of the things that when I do leadership training, within the first 20 minutes of the leadership training, I will throw up the Dunning-Kruger curve.
Yeah.
And I'll first will ask them, do they know what this is? And then I'll explain it in general. And I'll ask them to place themselves with a post-it note, where are they on the Dunning-Kruger curve with respect to understanding Agile or understanding the outcomes that we're trying to deliver?
Yeah.
And it's really interesting, because after we then do the training, I ask them to do the exercise again. Where are you now on the Dunning-Kruger curve? And of course, for those that aren't familiar with it, Dunning-Kruger curve is a 2x2 that sort of describes a pathway between level of confidence and experience and knowledge and capability as the bottom part of the matrix. And like teenagers, with very little experience, there's a high degree of confidence that they know everything when they're very, very early on. But the more experience they get in the world, and the more that they learn by doing and by experiencing what does work and what doesn't work, confidence drops all the way down until you are rooted in, I'm confident in what I know, knowing that there are so many things I don't know.
That's right.
And that's when confidence starts to increase.
I think they call it the valley of despair. I think
yes.
I've decided I'm very proud to live most of my life in the valley of despair these days. It's good. It's a good place to be, because if once you come to terms with it, you're going to go and open your eyes to a lot more learning.
Indeed. In fact, I think that there was a pivotal part of my career where I was in that valley of despair. And that actually links back to why I met Leonie Jennings and how I got introduced to your podcast. I had been out of work for 11 months after having been in a role where I thought that not only did I know everything I needed to know, but I had so much confidence that I was probably arrogant in my confidence. I had an exceptional team, a very small team. I'll give you a couple of dimensions because it's very fairy tale-esque, this scenario. We were working for Reuters, and Reuters had picked up myself and my team because we had originally formed under a company called Equinet. Now, Equinet, for those in the finance industry here, is the predecessor to Iris, the information vending system for Australia. And I had this really fabulous team that I handpicked, who we had a product owner in New York who would visit clients during the day. They would say, I'd really love it if the chart showed me this data point or did this or did that, or I just need a second version of this news screen so that it's filtering out XYZ. He would call us as he's leaving the office and say, this is the customer feedback today. And because my team were so knowledgeable and so expert in the software and in our clients' needs and the industry we're in, we would write either the finished changes or the prototype, email it back overnight. So when he walked in the office in the morning, he could take it straight to the client and say, is this what you meant? And they go, who are you people? Because no one, none of my vendors can do this. So we had a very small number of people producing, I can't remember what the figure was now, it was something like 200 million US in revenue per year on a cost base of ours of maybe only 1.5 million. So we were highly regarded by the organization, highly valued. But that led, of course, to a level of, I guess, overconfidence that, nothing could go wrong. We knew everything we needed to know. And then retrenchment came because they were sunsetting our product. And suddenly I found myself 11 months out of work. That was the moment in my life where I suddenly went, oh my God, I stopped learning some time ago. I've switched off that part of my brain. What am I going to do? That then triggered a reinvestment in going back and establishing learning as a everyday thing. It meant that I went off and did my PMI certification, which seemed to be one of the entries to getting any job at that time, regardless of what you did. And that then launched in my career back onto a trajectory again. So it was that realization that you don't know everything, that you almost must learn, and there are moments where your life suddenly gives you that kick and puts you in a valley of despair and makes you then realize that you don't know what you need to know.
100%. I think when I see the Dunning-Kruger curve, by the way, it always makes me smile. It's one of my favorite memes. You've got teenage daughters, as I do as well, and one of my favorite memes is it says picture of a fairly sassy girl, and it says, and there's no one more confident in the world than my teenage daughter telling me how to do something she's never done before. Which frequently gets sent to my kids. But you've got to admire confidence, but yeah, sometimes there's a lot of misplaced knowledge. That's the end of part 1. Catch us again next week as we go into part 2. Thank you for listening to Tales from Tech Titans, and be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcast. If you'd like to get more insights about tech careers, then check out the Ember, that's EMMBR LinkedIn page for the latest updates, articles, and engaging discussions.